perfect day to pause and look back at the lives and legacies of our nation's finest leaders. Here to help us is presidential historian Jane Hampton Cook, who joins us on days like Washington's birthday. Good morning to you, Jane.
Good morning.
Let's start at the beginning with George Washington. One of his most famous quotes was at his first inaugural, he said this: "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States." Analyze that for us. What's he talking about?
Well, George Washington, one of the greatest moments in presidential history was the first moment. When he became president, he gave an inaugural address and he gave thanks to God, the almighty being, the invisible hand, for the blessing of liberty. And he got us off to a great start as a country because we had traded royalty for representation.
That's a good point. All right. Meanwhile, fast forward a couple hundred years, here is Ronald Reagan sending a message directly to the leader of the other superpower of the world back then.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And of course, Jane, after he said that, people thought, you know, there's no chance that wall's ever coming down. It came down.
It did within 2 years. That was one of the most powerful moments in presidential history. Reagan's policies matched his actions, his words. They came together in this just amazing moment of strength. His policy of peace through strength came to fruition when the people took down that wall.
And he wasn't a president who was afraid to get tough with the Russians. I mean, he referred to Russia, the former Soviet Union, as the evil empire.
That's right. He had moral clarity, which really gave him gravitas on the world stage. And that's why we were a superpower back in the 1980s.
You're saying back in the 1980s, or you're saying we're regarded to a lesser extent these days?
Well, I think our standing in the world's diminished a little bit since then.
Well, that's too bad. Meanwhile,
Yes.
Back in the days in the land of Lincoln, when Lincoln was president, he said this, quote, "All persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free." That was one of the greatest moments of American history, certainly.
That's right. Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator. He corrected a great injustice, the greatest injustice in our nation's history, and that's why we honor him so much today.
We do indeed. And finally, we're going to take folks back to 1961. It was a bitterly cold day as well in Washington, D.C., when John Fitzgerald Kennedy was inaugurated our president. And he said this:
"And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country."
And that really got people thinking about public service, didn't it?
It did. And what I love about this moment is here's this young, vigorous new president, yet he gave a timeless message, a message that's just as relevant today as it was back in 1961.
Absolutely. As it turns out, we have one more presidential nugget to share with people, and it was after the dark days of September the 11th, 2001, George W. Bush came to Manhattan, the lower tip, not far from where the towers fell, and he said this:
"I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon."
Jane, why does that go down in history as one of the great moments in presidential history?
Because it was impromptu. Everything else we've talked about this morning was scripted, pre-planned. That was an impromptu, spur of the moment, but it was an example of courage, moral clarity, and decisiveness, which is why it really does stand out as an amazing moment in our history.
So in other words, it could be the greatest presidential ad lib of all time.
That's right. Absolutely.
Right. Jane Hampton Cook, presidential historian, joined us today on Washington's birthday. Thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you, Steve.
You bet.